worldwide. We all know that insecurity in the cyber world comes in all forms and is perpetrated, so to speak, by all kinds of players. But I think we should keep in mind that insecurity is not new. There's been industrial espionage around the world for as long as I think industry can remember, and as long as companies have existed. There have been attacks of all kinds by governments, including espionage, in all forms. It's not new, but in cyberspace, it's very much in the news, and sometimes in quite spectacular ways. And of course, there's insecurity caused by groups, by individuals, whether for mischief or for malice. They seem to be much more effective in cyberspace. So this distinguished panel is going to look a little bit at both enterprise level, the national level, the international level, perhaps a word on our massive infrastructure as well as our personal data, and we're going to try and see what is going on and what can be done. Let me just introduce them all to you. I'll start and go down here. Christopher Painter, he's a coordinator for cyber issues at the US Department of State. Mr. Toru Nakaya is Director General of the Institute for Information and Communication Policy at the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications of Japan. John Suffolk is Global Cybersecurity Office of Huawei. Before that, he was with the British government exactly on these issues. And we also have Burgess Cooper, who is Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Vodafone in India. Recently, I don't know if anybody, there's been a lot of books out on cybersecurity and cyber problems. And in an article that was reviewing them, this is sort of a paraphrase of that article. The real threat, and here was talking about virus attacks and so on, the real threat of things like Stuxnet is that it will morph into a cheap weapon available to organized crime, rogue nations, terrorists, and hacker kids with lots of time on their hands. And John Mose this morning said that it is only a matter of time before a cyber attack causes real physical damage to a critical and perhaps even a life-sustaining system. And I think you all heard Minister Sibal say that in what he was concerned about. And so my question to all of you is, in light of these kinds of sentiments, why is it so important that we would develop some kind of international understanding and good, strong national strategies and plans? And I'd like to ask you what you think is going on, what you are doing, and what perhaps are the possibilities that we would evolve this kind of understanding so that these rather, shall we say, catastrophic ideas do not materialize. How would you look at it, Chris?
Well, thanks. And I look at this. I've had either the benefit or a curse, I suppose, of being dealing with cyber issues and various cybersecurity issues for about 22 years now. So I've seen the ebb and flow, both in terms of the growth of the threat, and you've described some of that, and we've heard about that this morning, but also the growth in terms of awareness and response, both among governments, among businesses, and among societies generally. And I think that both of those have gone hand in glove, and that's an important thing to think about. As far as, I think one of the real developments I've seen, especially recently, and especially in the last few years, is this transforming from what was largely thought to be a very technical issue, an issue that governments at a policy level didn't really deal with so much, but the technical cognoscenti dealt with, to one where it's really transformed to something that's not just a technical issue, but a policy issue, a significant national and international policy issue for governments around the world. Certainly that's true in the US, when President Barack Obama said back in 2009 that the threats we face in cyberspace are some of the most significant economic and national security threats we face as a country, and there are a number of things that we need to do to protect ourselves from that. So part of that, as you said, Maria, is the importance of having a national strategy, elevating this as more of a priority within each of our countries. And a national strategy should have several components, but one of the core parts of any national strategy is saying that this is a really major policy issue for these countries. And indeed, the US has a national strategy, the UK has a national strategy. Actually, we've gone through a couple of them. France, Germany, about 20 countries have. India is developing one as well. And I think that's an important aspect. And that national strategy should tie together all the different parts of government, because different parts of government deal with this issue. It should be done in consultation with the private sector, because that's an important part of the puzzle in dealing with these issues. And it should be done in consultation with civil society. And they should have components that deal with how you protect your own infrastructure, whether it be government or the private sector, from intrusions and attack. It should have components that deal with how you do incident response, and you heard a little bit about this morning. But it also should have a component of how we deal with each other internationally. Now, on that latter point, one of the things that we developed in the US recently, about a year and a half ago now, was a international strategy for dealing with cyberspace. And that put cybersecurity in a greater context. Cybersecurity is critically important, but it is not the end in itself. It is an enabler for other things. And when you think about what the internet is, and if you think about it as a pyramid, the apex of that pyramid is social growth and economic growth and innovation. That's what we're trying to achieve. That's what cyberspace has really allowed us to do. At the base of the pyramid is security, protection from crime, protection of privacy, and even some of the political military issues, which we might discuss later.
None of which are unique to the cyberspace.
They're not, but I think we need to think about how we do this in this environment.
Evolve it into it.
And so when we came out with this international strategy, it was it brought all these disciplines together, both the openness of the internet, free expression, it brought economic aspects, security aspects, and it said that we were trying to achieve an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable communications infrastructure, not just for the US, but for the rest of the world, and working with other countries to do that. And we have spent a lot of time working on developing norms along the whole spectrum of these issues, including on cybersecurity and including on how international law applies here. And there's been, we'll talk more about this as we go on, but there's been a huge push in the US and around the world for a much more international collaboration, much more international focus on how we can collaborate on threats, criminal and other threats, and how we can tackle them. And again, we can address these.
I certainly would like to come back on it, especially it's a word that is sometimes not fully understood, how you develop norms. And norms of behavior are not rules necessarily. And it's a very interesting evolution how norms evolve over time and then become, if you wish, the other side of the word norms, normal ways of behaving. But also in Japan, I know that Japan is extremely interested in the international, takes an active role on cyber dialogues. And one of the questions I would have for you, Toru, is everyone is arguing whether the rules of cyberspace should be legally binding. But I think you're one of those who say treaties take much too long
yes,
to evolve. So what should we be doing? And how does Japan look at it?
Well, actually, unfortunately, there are many international fora in which countries are discussing whether the rules be legally binding or not. But all of them taking already long time, or 3 or 4 years discussing the same issue. And there's a very little progress on the substance. So our government has already started a discussion with industries and consumers to hammer out a joint guideline. Because we have to act fast to catch up the pace of the development of hacking technology. Of course, we are still on the way. But it is clear that legislation process or treaty-making process takes longer time because of the democracy. So we are having discussion with industry, a limited number of industries, to hammer out a model for other sectors. Then we go other sectors and use that model to apply another sector and adapt to the special environment of each sector. by doing this and by repeating this kind of sectoral approach, we'll be able to hammer out a national strategy. It's a kind of multi-stakeholder strategy. And we also content to mobilize consumers. And coincidentally, about 3 weeks ago, we had a very serious an accident. 3 users in Japan, the 3 users' PC was overtaken by a hacker, maybe probably a Japanese hacker. But the overtake, I mean, the virus came from overseas servers. So Japanese police didn't notice that, cannot trace the track and the origin. And because the hackers were so clever that he didn't leave any trace of hacking. And those PCs, so-called bots, were used to attack some websites in Japan. And to my surprise, Japanese police arrested those 3 persons.
Oh, they did?
Yeah. Arrested. And even though they kept denied of attack.
And it was from outside. They masked. Well,
they are prosecuted.
But Tara, tell me, Japan is also involved in the international
yeah, that's right,
dialogue.
That's
Are you building on your national experience and then sharing that, I understand, with other countries?
Yeah, we are trying to do so, especially in Asia, because, well, maybe in America, I believe US government is taking a leading role. But in Asia, still, they are looking at Japan and Korea for the model. So we are trying to show how we can cooperate with industries and consumers.
That's very interesting because your neighbor there, John, sort of spans Europe and Asia. And I know that the UK used to have a very lively, if you wish, and strong national ideas and national policies. But now you're also in the private sector with Huawei, and of course that has been on front page news as well. So tell us a little bit in between those 2 worlds how you see it.
It is very interesting, isn't it, when you begin to observe more than your country around the world, that the models governments around the world take. And you would think that governments would broadly do the same thing. Well, they don't, because some governments and some individuals and some corporations, they run away from fear. And from a cybersecurity perspective, there's a fear there, so they run away from it. And that's about locking things down and saying no. If you look at many corporations, though, and actually many salespeople, they run towards success. What is it that I have to do to be successful? And of course, the mindset of running away from fear and running towards success are often at 2 ends of the same spectrum. So what I see from when I was in government, and what I see with dealing with 140 governments around the world now, is that depending on where people are on that spectrum, they take a different approach to cybersecurity. You touched on this earlier. It would be wrong to suggest that cybersecurity is number 1 on every government agenda. It isn't. It's about better health, better education, economic development, import, export, and a range of other complex issues. And as I think we would all agree, cybersecurity, or the use of technology, fundamentally underpins that. You know, I am extremely proud of my time that I spent in the public service. I think anyone who is a public servant, you know, does things to put, you know, educate your children, fix people up when they're better, put food on the table. These are all fundamentally important social things to do. But the reason why we're in this room is because the thing that will stop the adoption of the next billion netizens is the fear of cybersecurity. Can I trust who I am dealing business with? So when I'm dealing with different governments now, and I'm dealing with different, customers, like one of my colleagues here and some more in the room, again, their starting point is different in terms of cybersecurity. They want us to do, whatever we can to make sure that we protect their business, run towards success, and protect their customers, run away from failure. And then you get into the whole debate in terms of, well, when you collaborate, where does collaboration fit into this? Because again, collaboration, just like recruitment, if you read all the research on recruitment, we tend to recruit people like each other, like us. I recruit people like me. And the risk of collaboration is we collaborate with people like us. But as we have heard time and time again, and especially from Minister Sibel this morning, we are intertwined, we are interconnected, so we must collaborate with everybody, even if they are not like us. And I see this in operators, customers, governments, and I see this in national strategies as well.
You mentioned one word a minute ago, building up of trust. Now, you're working across borders from, and let's not mince words here, a company from a country that very often is finger pointed at. And yet you talk about minimizing cyber threats by the building up of trust, first between your companies and the companies that are your clients as well as your suppliers, all of us and many of you in the room, but also perhaps across borders in this case. How do you go about stimulating that collaboration and that trust?
That's a very good question. I think we were having this conversation before we came up here earlier. I won't embarrass people in the room by asking people if they think they are keeping up with the technological rate of change and the consequences of that change. Because when I go around the world and ask people the question, they say, technology is moving so quickly that I can't keep up with it. I can't keep up with the consequences of making a decision. That is true for us as individuals, including me. It is true for government policymakers. It is true for chief executives. And therefore, you can have as many policies and procedures as you want, but that does not form trust. It's a behavioral issue. So at Huawei, we are proud of our Chinese heritage. We are proud at being the world's leading Chinese private telecommunications company. But to build the trust, to address the issue that you say, because of the finger pointing, the only way you can do that is to basically open up everything you do to any kind of audit, inspection, standard policy procedure you can think of. And this again is where I fundamentally agree with the Minister this morning. We will collectively make progress if we all agree to verification, audit, standards, because that's what grows a market. The moment you begin to step away, certainly in our position and say, you can't see this, we'd prefer you not to look there, it only leads one way, which is, well, why would they want to not show us these things? And of course, I use the same supply chain that you do. Our suppliers are the same as your suppliers. 70% of everything that goes into Huawei equipment actually is not from mainland China. Our biggest provider are our friends in America. So when I look at cybersecurity, I take away labels and countries and cultures and all the noise that goes around it and say, what outcome am I trying to deliver? My outcome is, he trusts me to buy equipment from me because I've showed him everything. Jerry over there does the same thing. And of course, my colleagues' view here may be different to your view, and your view, and your view, and your view. So success is a variable thing. But if we all go through, anyone can inspect, anyone can audit, anyone can verify, built on internationally agreed standards, I think that's how you build trust.
Well, that would be very good, John. For the moment, we do not have those standards or the benchmarks, and maybe that's something that we should be moving towards. I'd like to take it just one level deeper, if you wish, which is down to the enterprise level. And here, we really are sometimes in much more trouble than even on the international level, because at the enterprise level, there are all sorts of things going on. Everything from completely new systems of cloud computing, people who bring their personal devices to work and they don't obey anything there's an interplay today between the personal and the corporate or enterprise life of every single individual that has become quite complex, I should think, for any company trying to set good standards. So these kinds of mechanisms, the challenge also of the mobile internet, if you wish, must complicate the life of a company like Vodafone.
Sure. So to answer your question on the collaboration part and how do you combat cybersecurity, and then going on further to how does a company which is global, spread across many continents, ensure it safeguards its security and privacy. On the first part on collaboration, there are two types of collaboration which a company national can do. First is with the official part, which is with the local CERT authorities or with DSCI and NASCOM, where you engage in policy building or cyber drills to ensure your security is maintained. But then there's also the unofficial part, where in India, which happens is leading security heads, CISOs like us, from banks, from telcos, from across the industry, who meet once a quarter over 2 days, where we share at the required levels on type of attacks, where's the industry going to, new technologies coming in, what are the safe measures, what are the best practices. And both these official and unofficial methods put together would serve as a good level of defense for a company who wants to be at the leading edge of the curve. Coming to your second question on how does a company spread across many continents safeguard its security, I think it starts from the basics. If you have your basics in place, if you do your base hardening guidelines, you deploy it centrally, you monitor it across all times, and you routinely engage in incident management practices where you play cyber drills, where different Amazon or different type of cloud services are utilized to combat and bombard your network across 24 or 48 hours, which is the time a cyber attack lasts, and you check your incident responses again and again. They say the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war, and cybersecurity is war. The point is, how often have you rehearsed and practiced your incident response to be ready to combat an event?
But Burgess, you practically have to do that continuously. I mean, it's not as if you could do it once a month.
No, so you keep
back.
on checking your strengths and different types of strengths, different type of vectors. It's not just technology, it's people and processes. You've got to put all the three controls of preventive, detective, and corrective across the domains of people, process, and technology. Have you informed your communications people? Have you informed your customers? Have you informed your PR, your management, your counterparts? Do you do a follow-the-sun approach? Do you know where the IPs are coming from? Do you know how to combat those IPs?
But that's a very good point that you bring up, and one that's a little contentious. We talk well about it, but I sense in the world a little reluctance about a full sharing of knowledge about what goes on. I wonder if any of you have any thoughts about whether that's quite natural and will continue, whether you have nationally some ways of overcoming that, and informing and keeping your own national companies well up to date. How does that work with you?
Well, you know, one of the things that's, I think, one of the most overused terms in this area is public-private partnership, because it's not defined what you mean, but when you really define it, it really is this trust element. It's how you share information between the public sector and the private sector that's actionable information on both sides. And I think there's been a number of strides made in the U.S. in terms of how we share with our private sector, how we have input from our private sector, both in our policy making, but also sharing information. So
Have they stopped trying to hide it when things happen? How does it work?
I think it's been a struggle for many, many years to have companies, when there's been a breach, report those breaches. And there's reasons for that. They don't know what the capabilities of government are. They're concerned about the effect on their businesses. However, you know, you need to turn that equation around and really demonstrate the business benefit to coming to government and talking about those issues, and how government can help ameliorate some of those threats. And I think that there's been some real progress in doing that, either going to the certs where you can anonymize some of that information, or you know, actually following up on some of the threats. So part of that trust that's been built, you mentioned exercises and how you would go through that. So that's also done by government. So we did, in the last year, what's called our national level exercise, which has traditionally looked at earthquakes and other major events. This last year, it was presidential-led, and it focused on the cyber issue and how we respond to a major cyber issue in the U.S. And it wasn't just the government, it was the government and industry working together. When our Department of Homeland Security built its incident response plan, how we deal with a major cyber incident, the private sector was there from the beginning building that plan, and that was very important too. So as you think about building this trust, it's both sharing information, tactical information, but it's also sharing and getting involvement in the policy-making process, so they're not feeling like they're an isolated group, that this is a common undertaking. And just, if I can, one comment on something you said earlier,
yes,
which was this issue of how we bring this to more of an international community. Not only are we having a lot of these bilateral dialogues, and now we've done dedicated bilateral dialogues on cyber with India, with Brazil, with South Africa, with Korea, with Japan, and many others. But there's been a real effort, I think, to think about capacity building, work with the developing world on this, because it's not just a part of the world that's dealing with these issues, it's the entire world, and we need to plug in and do that.
So there is people are on different speed tracks, so to speak, on this?
Yes, but you can also use regional organizations. So for instance, in Asia, we've used the Asian Regional Forum to talk about issues around confidence building measures, about proxies in cyberspace. In the OAS, the Organization for American States, we recently did a seminar, the Canadians and others and the entire OAS group, on how you build national strategies for cyberspace. Right. So there are a lot of different activities around the world where we need to continue to plug in all of us, whether it's governments or industry or the civil societies in our countries, to advance this.
You know, listening to you, I think we can all live with a fear factor because we don't know what's going on. But listening to you, it's very heartening to understand that there is a continuous and changing processes that are going on at company, at national, regional, and international level. One question, though, I might have for yourselves, or anyone to pick it up, are they fast enough? Do you think that they are adequate, the kind of dialogues and collaborative ventures that are going on? Or would you wish, Toru, for something more robust or even more global? I'll ask all of you the same question. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I think the global approach, I mean, to seek for the unanimous consensus on cyber issues is very, very difficult. So the regional approach and sectoral approach is better than the global approach. But as she pointed out, maybe it's not sufficient. So we have to go step by step. And sometimes we don't stick to the existing framework, but to get together in a small number of groups to hammer out a model. And that model can be used in another group or another sector. But anyway, what we should do is to make something better than before and take gradual approach. Rather than making something complete at once, we have to go step by step so that many people can get together to improve them and adapt them to their special situation. That's
I understand. Please chime in, anyone who wants to at any time. John, Chris, go ahead. John?
Let me just say a few words. In my experience, I think governments are normally exceptionally good at sharing with other governments. Certainly like-minded governments, not all governments, because not all governments share everything to governments they like. But generally speaking, I think governments are exceptionally good at doing this for all kinds of reasons. I think governments are getting better at coming away from their political into the private domain because they recognize more that actually the world and the individual government can't make progress without the private sector. And occasionally we might even think about the citizen, but that's not often yet, I have to say. It tends to be government first, then maybe a little bit of collaboration and sharing with the private sector. But I do sense on occasions, and it is only on occasions, that in some quarters, I see cybersecurity and things like vulnerabilities being used as a competitive advantage. And I think that's a bad sign. I think we all must fight against anyone seeing cybersecurity. If I pick on someone's vulnerability or I can declare someone's vulnerability, maybe I will sell a few more products. The reality is the market is much bigger if everyone feels the market is much safer. And I think, certs have an important role. We talked about norms earlier, to talk about those norms. I think governments have that role, and I especially think vendors have that role as well. We are in this together. And of course, we all connect to each other, so we're only as good as our weakest link as far as the hackers are concerned.
And yet, it happens.
It does happen.
No, both happens. The security movement forward, but also the unfortunate and rather devastating insecurity does happen. And then I'll turn to you, Burgess. Do you want to say something first?
Sure. So as they said, security is as strong as the weakest link. And the response to your question is, are the controls adequate? While there are some governments, some companies, and some certs who are definitely ahead of the curve, some are catching on. The idea is to get the weaker parts up to the higher levels and the stronger ones moving much more ahead to ensure that the overall curve of security is maintained. And as an industry and as a government together, we move further.
Quite good. Still a long haul.
And to build on what's going on here, I mean, you mentioned that a lot of these regional approaches are really good. When you talk about a global approach, the question always presents itself, a global approach to what?
To what?
You know, we do, for instance, in the cybercrime area, have the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which many countries have signed on to, including Japan recently, which sets a good base of the kind of laws you need, and that was talked about a little bit this morning. We do have, at Budapest again, 2 weeks ago, we were all in Budapest for a conference on cyberspace that talked about all the different issues, the economic issues and the security issues, and that was good because it brought high-level government officials together, industry and civil society all together on the whole range of issues here, so that's good. And we've been making progress in a lot of these different forums, including in the UN and the group of government experts, looking at the more pointy bits on this, the law of armed conflict, what the norms are there. And there, very importantly, we've said that existing international law applies to cyberspace. It's not such a different thing that existing rules don't apply, and we need to figure out how those rules apply. So I think this idea to think we need one ring that rules them all, to use a Lord of the Rings analogy, we don't really. We need to have all these different activities because you have to say, what are you trying to address? We have great CERT-to-CERT cooperation. We're trying to build that. That's important. We have great law enforcement cooperation. Are these adequate? No. We have tons more we need to do, and we need to make this more robust. Are they leaps and bounds above where they were just a few years ago? Absolutely, and I think that's something to focus on too.
Well, that's very encouraging. I promised that we would take questions, so please, I'm just going to stand up because I can't see you all very well. There's a microphone right there, and there's one over there, and I'd like to take one or two first, so don't be shy. This is a wonderful group of people who can answer a lot of problems, as they're the ones that are doing some of the solutions. Yes, please go ahead. Just briefly introduce yourself, if you could.
Adya Shukla. I am a fellow at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and I'm working on Department of Defense project in collaboration with MIT. It's very heartening to know that public-private partnership, especially as you have explained, is flourishing. I get the sense, but when I have analyzed the cybersecurity strategy document of US government itself, what actually really occurs to me that the obligation on the part of the private sector is not to share the information, is not really at the level of obligation. It's kind of, furnish that information if you want to have some kind of incentivization from some kind of branding, some kind of trust building from the government side. But I want to know how can we actually increase this information sharing, because a policy without enforcement is a policy without teeth.
You're bringing up a question actually that we discussed previously, and it's a very contentious issue, and that is the requirement for, I suppose you would say, cyber reporting. I don't know quite how else to do it. And it works both ways, and I think it's a very interesting question. Because it works also, cyber reporting, to report on the robustness of your, let's say, the framework in which a company is operating. In other words, how good it is against standards that perhaps a country can set, but also the opposite, when it doesn't match up to them and there are breaches. Is there liabilities and problems of this sort involved, or how would you all look at it? Should there be national standards that one has to report towards, or benchmarks, or the opposite, report just on the breaches? How would you see this evolving? John, and then Chris?
It is a great question, and again, it comes back to my point. Do you want your private sector to run away from fear? So the more liabilities you put in, the more fear you get. It doesn't mean you get a quality end result. Just look at financial services. They're legislated and regulated to hell around the world. It doesn't mean that we've got a brilliant financial services when you look back over the last 10 years. But I actually think government can look at these things a different way. And I know I used to bore for my country on this. But governments, first of all, they're probably the biggest employer in any country. Typically, they employ 1 in 5 of the working population around the world. And they're typically the biggest buyers of technology in their country. So a government just to come out and say, this is what is right for us, having shared the information with their government colleagues around the world, and if you want to bid for government work, you must achieve this level, this standard, this approach, this policy, whatever you want to call it, instantly the vendor market moves to that level. It's not about regulation. It's not about standards. Just a government saying, this is what good looks for me based on all the people I've talked to.
Yes, but that will move over time, so you
of
have
course,
to keep updating.
Correct. So we move up to that level. Maybe 3 years later, the level has shifted because we've learned some new things. Governments often think their success is measured by how many laws they put into practice. The private sector thinks the less laws, the better. And I just think there's a different way we can handle raising the standard for everybody without legislation.
So you put in benchmarks and things of this kind.
However you want to define it.
Chris?
So I think there are a couple aspects of this problem. One is you do need to build incentives in to try, and part of those incentives, if you give something back, you can expect something from the private sector, and I think that's one way you do it. And you have to be careful when you're thinking of any kind of regulatory regime not to stifle innovation and growth in the industry at the same time, and regulations can be static and not helpful in that way, but you can approach this from a couple different ways. One, in terms of reporting, a number of our states in the United States, we don't have a national one yet, have data breach reporting laws that require reporting at least to some companies of data breach, but they also allow a safe harbor so that law enforcement and others can investigate. Two, and this was exemplified in our recent cybersecurity legislation that the administration, the U.S., the Obama administration sent to the Hill. Core to that legislation, one key part, which we still hope will pass at some point, was this idea that we would work, the government would work with core critical infrastructure. That doesn't mean everyone. It means core critical infrastructure to come up with flexible standards that can then be enforced, and that they would have an incentive to then actually meet those standards. And that makes us all safer. So that's another part of it as well. And there's also roles, certainly for regulated industries and for publicly traded companies.
Certainly
so there's a
starting
number
with,
of ranges.
Exactly, but certainly starting, perhaps to answer your question, certainly starting with some of the more critical areas and working, as you said before, Tara, working from example to example and sector and sector. Did you want to add anything in this sphere of, yes, mandatory reporting, if you wish?
I also would like to emphasize the role of users and consumers. The reason why I introduced the mistake of the police is that now Japan got the good opportunity to raise awareness of Japanese people on cybersecurity. Now, they realize that anybody can be arrested if there's a clever hacker. So they got to know that they have to be prepared for something. And if something happens, they have to be informed very well. Otherwise, they will be affected more and more. So this kind of pressure could be a good incentive for industries.
It sounds like a disincentive, but anyway, that's I think we have, let me get to see if there's some more questions and then we'll continue. I think I see two, so I'm going to take several questions and then come back to you. Over here, and then the gentleman with the microphone, and there's another microphone for you over there. I'm afraid there are none that are roving. You'll have to go to a microphone. Please, go ahead.
Thank you.
I'll leave you to take some notes on, yes, please, sorry.
Chaudhary, former Secretary Internal Security, Government of India. The issue was deliberated at length at the last Global Cybersecurity Summit as well. In the breakaway sessions which I attended, there was general agreement that we should move forward with a draft agreement.
On what?
On cybercrime, cyber rules, how to use cyberspace, not to harm critical information infrastructures of various countries. My question is, how are we ready with the draft? Are we closer to such an agreement?
We do bring that, but we certainly will bring it back again. How close are we, at least to understanding what we need to agree on? Please, over here.
I would like to...
I'm sorry, if you could just say your name, sir.
Yeah, Suresh Ramasubramanian from IBM.
Thank you.
I would like to thank the Japanese gentleman for raising the issue of cooperation with civil society, and Mr. Painter for how government can engage effectively with industry. This kind of cooperation is much more prevalent and it's much deeper in the States as far as I've seen, and there is a much deeper level of engagement which goes beyond sharing of expertise and a mutual understanding of each other's threat pictures and concerns. which probably goes much further towards building understanding than in another location where this does not exist. When you're talking about treaties, these are between governments, and I seriously doubt that you would have consensus, because quite often when you have consensus among a majority of people, they are not going to engage in such behavior, fine. But the problem is when you get even one or two other entities that say, we are not going to sign this.
Yes, and you have the outliers, inside and outside, and that could cause some problems. We'll ask them that
Absolutely.
question. Thank you, sir. And there was one other gentleman here who would like to pose a question, please. Yes. Could you possibly introduce yourself? Just tell us your name, sir.
Yes, I'm Bob Shellman from Reliance Globalcom. Very briefly, and it's a short question, is in cybersecurity enforcement, do you envision some form of NATO type of alliances with weapons of mass cybersecurity destruction as some form of those alliance arrangements?
Between like-minded, in other words, those that would voluntarily get together. Right, well, we have some pointed questions here. Is it possible to have cyber agreements? We said before that that seems a very lengthy way to go about it, and let's look at that. Is there cooperation high level in the US, but are we serious about an international type of consensus and an alliance? Is that possible, perhaps among like-minded nations? Who would like to take a stab at it? Chris, you want to go, and then Toro? And anyone who wants to take a stab.
So I think we addressed the first question before. I mean, I think that having, and I spoke at the last DWA conference, I don't think there was a groundswell that we needed one treaty to deal with this. And indeed, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different areas here and a lot of socialization around these norms that we talked about that needs to be done. And in fact, we do have some good treaty instruments, both the Budapest Convention and others, that I think we need to figure out how to get other countries to work on. In terms of getting the private sector and civil society both more involved, I think that's something that we have been, when countries do their national strategies around the world, what I've seen is that they have consulted with those groups, and that's been a modeling effort because they realize those groups are really important to build those strategies in a way that makes sense. And there are some countries who don't have a tradition of dealing with the private sector or civil society, but more and more I think they're understanding the necessity to do it in this space, and I think that's a good thing. And on the third issue, let me broaden that out a little bit more and
Whoops. That was not an earthquake, just a microphone.
And this goes to this issue which often comes up of cyber conflict and the risks and the worries about cyber conflict. Well, part of that is building alliances, certainly, but part of that is building better transparency and trust among countries, including countries who may not always agree, who perhaps are perceived as opposing threats to other countries. So one of the ways we do this, I mentioned the applicability of international law. So there's something called the law of armed conflict that applies to cyberspace, just like it applies to the rest of the world, and many countries around the world have held that. Our legal advisor in the State Department has made a speech about this recently and talked about what that means. What that means is this is not a lawless space, but a space where laws do apply and where there are constraints on state behavior. But that's one part of it. That's the norm part of it. The second part is the practical things we can do to build better confidence, better transparency, better cooperation, and ultimately better stability. The point here is to avoid conflict and to make sure that conflict doesn't benefit any state. So a transparency measure may be as simple as just exchanging points of contact between countries. It could be cooperation among their certs. For instance, it could be exchange of doctrines, what they're doing in their national strategy. A cooperative measure could be countries cooperating against a third-party threat, like a botnet, for instance.
Okay, well, this is something, let me just push on that a little bit, given the last intervention question. Is it foreseeable, or is it something that might be working towards, when you talk about a NATO-type alliance, I'm talking about, for instance, a few countries getting together and agreeing that if any one of them is attacked in their infrastructure or some important way, together they would cooperate in order to find and to perhaps withstand such a thing. Does that
Well, NATO has done that in terms of its new
Right.
strategic concept. Cyber is part of its strategic concept. The core activity in NATO so far has been protecting its own systems because they were, it was determined they were really necessary to protect. But part of that, and this was triggered in part by the Estonian event back in 2007, is that countries would aid each other and work with each other. So again, that's
you think
part
it's
of it.
already in place?
I think, you know, again, this is an evolving area, but I think within the NATO structure, there's some attention to that. And also bilaterally with other countries, this is coming up. But ultimately, I would go back to this idea of building a more stable environment generally. And reaching that through practical measures to cooperate among countries. And the last thing I'd say is one of the forums we're doing this is in the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe.
Yes, John.
Can I change the tone? I'm beginning to get depressed here, and I fancy like I want to slash my wrists.
Why?
We've talked about mass destruction, we've talked about potentially loss of life, we've talked about intellectual property loss, and all the rest of it. We've not had a conversation about the good things of technology. We've not had a conversation about what is it that technology vendors that are creating technology that enables people to do the things that we're talking about should be doing to drive the quality up, accepting there's no guarantees. But I think we need to be looking forward from a positive perspective rather than looking from a mass doom perspective, because the more you frighten people, whether it be a government, silly mistakes happen, the more you frighten businesses, they don't do the things they should do and maybe they're not as economically viable as they should be, the more you frighten citizens, the less they use technology, which in essence drives an economy forward. And I really do think we need to move the debate forward in terms of what is it the vendors need to do to drive the quality up? Because that's a long-term strategy. And what we're doing is talking of, you know, weapons of mass destruction, NATO doing this. It may well be happening. I'd like the counterbalance, which is saying this is what we're going to commit to as an IT industry. Otherwise, we're going to be having this debate about war and all these bad things because it ticks up. What was normal and quite, you know, scary one year becomes the normal the next year. So you tick it up again. That only leads you one way, and it's not a good way.
And that goes back to, I think, where I opened, which is security is not the end goal. Security is the foundation, and we always have to keep in mind the positive elements of this. And indeed, you know, it was no accident that our international strategy led with the economic benefits and ended with the social benefits, and all the security stuff was in between.
And not to forget what you said before, this is not a lawless space.
And it's not a lawless space, but you're absolutely right as well, that one of the things we need to do is not just concentrate on the threats, but think of what the innovation we can promote is. And part of that innovation is having an ecosystem that protects against those threats. And that's really what raises all boats. If you have better protection in place, you get rid of a lot of these threats, and you can have a platform for better innovation.
So a simple question, because this is a think-do environment. I haven't seen a law anywhere in the world which says it is illegal to buy a zero-day exploit.
A what?
A zero-day exploit, which is an unknown vulnerability which someone knows where they could exploit it to their benefit and often to the disbenefit.
Right.
Isn't a do thing across all of the sharing, the government conferences, all of the standards bodies to say we're going to outlaw the acquisition of those?
That's interesting. Just one more question.
Toro and then Burgess, go ahead.
So while my panelists answer the questions about the government part, it's always the government and the public, the private partnership works together. And there are a lot of associations like the GSMA or the Security Council of India, which partner with the government, who have the technical expertise and the ability to dive deep in, advise the government on these matters. And only when such associations like the GSM, DSAI, who work with the governments in their respective countries, will we have a much more stronger approach.
That's a very interesting point that we have not raised, but which is also in the positive side. There are many fora. This is not a monolithic effort. There are many fora, many specialized groups that are working on different parts of infrastructure, on building up the strength of a good security all across a spectrum of international communications and internet architecture everywhere. So this is not taking place in a monolithic way at the very top of governments or across just a few companies. This is taking place in an extremely broad spectrum, and that effort in itself becomes an awareness building exercise of norms that are slowly of behavior that are accepted and adopted. So complex as it isn't necessarily, as you say, completely chaotic. Toro, before we close our session in a few minutes, did you want to add anything to this particular issue?
Yes, with regard to the treaty-making process, well, I think I personally believe that it is better to have something legally binding. But, well, we tend to focus on the language when we discuss the legally binding text. And we sometimes forget the, how we implement and how much it is workable. So rather than focusing on legally binding document, Japan is taking an approach to focus on the practicability and workability of a guideline or norms of code of conduct. And how we apply that rule is more important than making rule itself.
No, that's the way industry has, and business and governments have worked for a long time. I'll take one more question unless there's a second person who wants, and then we will answer and close our session. Yes, please.
Hi, Mike O'Riordan, Vice Co-Chair.
We seem to have a trouble with that microphone. Can, okay, speak into it.
Hello there. Mike O'Riordan, Co-Chairman of the Messaging and Anti-Abuse Working Group. With regard to the comment made by the gentleman from Huawei, I think if one was to start banning the trade of zero-day exploits, what you'd actually do is have a very chilling effect on the entire research community. And the vendors of a lot of technology equipment rely on these people to come up with these zero-day exploits because they don't look into them themselves.
I think we would agree with you. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always been one of the concerns. You know, in the U.S., if they then use that, or if there's an intent to use it, then that's a criminal act and we can go after them. This simple creation alone, because it could be used for a security purpose, is a more difficult issue. And so that's why I think it's not criminalized in the U.S. or in many parts of the world.
But,
John,
you know, I agree with your point. What you don't want to do is to drive people underground. You don't want people not to identify vulnerabilities. But maybe there are better ways of doing it. So in essence, we were talking about certs and cert to certs. That actually we begin to say if you find a vulnerability via any route, there is an agreed route that everyone knows about it, and it can't be used for a purpose that it was never intended. So I think we need to begin to say, we have all kinds of rules in the offline world which we don't necessarily have in the online world, and people's ability to do harm, I think we need to begin to ask questions, how are we going to close that down?
We're coming to the end of our session, so I'm going to ask each of you, each one of you, and leave you a chance to if you wish, close with an idea, positive or negative, of what you would like to see happen in the next years. Close, we can't look too far out. So why don't you, Burgess, if there's something that you would like to leave with all of us that you would like to see happen, tell us.
So while we spoke on technology, the processes, the government, the policies, the treaties, I think one important aspect which Mr. Toru just touched on is awareness, whether awareness of public, awareness in schools, in cybersecurity practices, in safe social networking practices. A big portion of the defense to combat cybersecurity lies in awareness, awareness, awareness across all levels, and I believe that would be a big factor to combat cybercrime.
John?
I think mine would be an international push to move up the quality of the technology that we produce from independent verification and standards.
A recommendation from yourself, Toru?
And I deeply welcome this initiative by EWI. Last year, London Cyber Conference started. I wonder how long it will last, but actually it will take place in Korea next year. And this is my first EWI conference, but I found out that experts are deeply discussing on the matter and taking these issues very seriously. So it's also a good point. And I hope that this kind of activity will spread in all over the world. Thank you.
And so from my perspective, we have to think of this as we're still in the early days of a lot of these discussions. However, the fact that so many governments are paying attention to this, and the conference in Korea next year, which will be the successor to the Budapest conference, which is the successor to the London conference, I think that's really important. The more, and this goes back to the awareness point, the more that we raise this level of this issue as a serious, important issue for governments around the world, where we can discuss these issues and build better cooperation, the better. And so what I'd like to see is a continuation and acceleration of that. And we have seen substantial moves that way in the last couple of years, but I want to see that continue.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if the upshot, I think, of our panel is one that's very encouraging, which is instead of concentrating on the concept of cyber insecurity, we should be concentrating on the building of cyber security. In other words, turning it around and building on things that we are already underway in the international world. And so I'm not at all discouraged. Just let's remember that this is a difficult process because every single other day there is a newness in the technology and new players that come on. So we will never arrive at full security, as we don't in any other realm. But we will certainly find the processes and the players that will somehow or other start working continuously on the progress of strengthening our security for all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to turn over now to Carl Rauscher. He's already Chief Technology Officer and Distinguished Fellow at EWI. And we'll just stay here and listen to him for a moment.
Well, please join me in thanking for Maria and the panelists for a great discussion here. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. Now it's time to transition from this plenary part of the program to the working part of the program. As was very evident from the questions we've gotten this morning from the audience, there's a lot of ideas and a lot of interest from the audience, and now we're going to transition to having you do the work and be part of the solution, as is one of our taglines for this conference. And this, in the next 15 minutes, it's your last chance, if you haven't yet, to fill out your survey. It just takes 2 minutes, and then just either leave it at your desk or give it to one of the ladies in the blue saris on the way out, because we want to get your feedback and compile this as our official statistics from this event. So as I mentioned, this is the time now to roll up your sleeves, to put your seatbelt on, or saddle up your horses, depending on whatever analogy or phrase you want to think of yourselves. But we need your help now. We're going to be involved in some very intense discussions, and I'm going to hopefully provide you evidence and encouragement that the hours we're going to spend are going to be worthwhile, because this process is working, as we have some evidence for that. So I'm going to tell you, how do we prioritize the topics we focus on? Because you're going to wonder, how can we have these options as opposed to others? What is a breakthrough group that you've been hearing about? And what kind of progress have you been making and have we been making together in doing this? And where do we go from here? There are a lot of topics you've heard about today, and a lot of others that will be discussed at other cybersecurity conferences. And a question, as I mentioned before, is we should all understand how we're picking these topics. We tend to deal with topics that are very difficult and where there's not a lot of progress being made. But the first thing to understand is we have 4 strategic high-level objectives consistent with the mission of the Institute to make the world a better place and to deal with very difficult issues. We're first trying to build trust amongst countries that don't typically always speak with each other. We're also trying to pioneer rules of the road for cyber conflict, champion emergency preparedness. Many of my U.S. colleagues are getting messages from family members or themselves involved with their contingency planning, not exercises, actual execution right now with the historic crisis we're dealing with back home. But increasingly we have more dependence on the connectivity electronically, and so these are really important issues for us to deal with. And also unleashing the private sector leadership in new ways. There are things you'll hear being done now that have never been done before in terms of the level of boldness and initiative being taken by the private sector. Further to that, to clarify our focus, we ask ourselves a question about, is the subject international? Is it policy related as opposed to technology? Is it something where if there was a breakthrough, the impact would be significant? I mean, our board at the Institute expects us to be doing things that would be very significant, making the world a better place. And there's some other criteria you can see there. So we rate every opportunity, and we select those that are most significant along those criteria. We also look at cyberspace according to this 8-ingredient framework. This is a little bit technical for a while, but we show this diagram to show that there are 8 essential ingredients for cyberspace. If you had 7, you wouldn't have enough. If you had 9, it would be too many. And policy, just like software and hardware and networks are essential, policy is essential, because you need to be able to have entities anticipate the behavior of other entities, whether they be machines, individuals, governments, organizations. They need to be able to know how to do these things. And so policy includes agreements, standards, and regulations also. Basically, policy, as time moves on, is not advancing at the rate of technology, and thus we have gaps. And we have existing mechanisms, of which we have people on this panel and throughout the room involved from government and industry, standards bodies, doing these activities. But there's also a sliver of activity, it seems, where a not-for-profit philanthropic group like the EastWest Institute can engage in. And some of the benefits we have some agility. We have the ability to engage experts in a very flexible way. And we also are buffered from commercial interests or from the interests of any given nation state. I actually have co-authored a paper out there on fresh tracks that kind of rethinks the way international cybersecurity policy can be done. So feel free to take a look at the poster out there in the breakthrough group that discusses this. How do we deliver our recommendations? Well, many of you are familiar with the reports that we've produced in the last 2 years, and we have a new one coming out. In fact, I'd like to talk about 3 major areas we focused on recently. But just before I do that, I'd like to point out that we see our recommendations progressing through 3 levels of maturity that are progressively correlated with value that they deliver. We first of all have come up with innovative ideas. You know, I say we, I mean we're talking about this group that's assembled here today and the other groups we've worked with throughout the year. And so far we've had 27 recommendations addressing very hard problems that meet the criteria I mentioned before that aren't being addressed, would have a high impact and such. And we have 14 of those, 52%, actually being implemented by major companies and governments and other organizations. And we actually have 7 of those being institutionalized by organizations that are long-term sustainable. And we expect these numbers to continue to grow over the years. Here's another way of looking at those statistics, and we expect it in the coming year to see more recommendations be put forth that will be adopted and actually be institutionalized. We're excited about some of the potential partners we'll be working with to adopt these for long-term support. So let me talk about 3 examples of what was on that chart. So a report that we came out with just a few weeks ago is Priority International Communications. Basically, when something really important happens in terms of a crisis like we've seen with the Fukushima crisis, what we've seen with what's going on right now in New York City, 9/11, the London bombings, the Mumbai terrorist attacks, there's more people that want to communicate than we have bandwidth to support. That's the way networks are designed. If they were designed otherwise, it would cost like 10 times more at least, 10 to 100 times more for your services and such. And there is congestion, and people have come to live, you know, and accept that congestion. The thing is, you can actually avoid that by implementing existing standards that have been around for over 10 years, and it's software. In fact, the next slide I show here is an S-curve of investment versus value that you'll rarely see in business. I mean, the green line there is typical relationship between as you invest and the value you get out of this, but with very little investment with existing public networks and using the existing phones that you have, government-authorized experts and decision makers can be given priority so that no matter where they are in the world, they can always get through in congestion. And that red line is what I'm referring to. You very seldom see an opportunity like that. We don't need to build new networks. We could use the existing networks and get tremendous value of having the most critical people in the private sector and public sector be almost guaranteed getting through in any type of crisis by implementing this kind of capability. We explained in here with consensus recommendations from experts from around the world how that could be done, and we have 4 very tightly articulated recommendations. And I will mention one thing to talk about how we listen and how you contribute to these things, because someone said in the summit a year ago that we need to be able to make sure this is very clear to people in the simplest way and include a story. So we actually have one of our colleagues here, Thomas Lynch, actually put together a storyboard. And we call these comic strips, you know, we were kids and stuff like that, but explains a very interesting scenario of how this scenario, how this capability could make a difference in an example example So this was something that came out of the summit last year, and encourage you to take this report, read it, and help us get this implemented. And there will be 2 discussions on this today and tomorrow in the sessions. The next example deals with Rigucci. Now, Rigucci report we actually delivered in our first summit in Dallas 2 years ago. This has 12 recommendations that will make the world more stable economically and also ensure a higher reliability for global connectivity. As was mentioned earlier today, over $10 trillion every day of just financial transactions takes place through undersea cable networks. And these things are very delicate. You know, they're made out of fiber optics, and there's single points of failure, and there's various recommendations. We have Dean Viverka here from the International Cable Protection Committee helping to lead various discussions on implementing those recommendations. We actually have people from the Indian government who've been working very hard over the last year of taking on some very difficult recommendations in this area. One thing that we're showing here in this slide is data that came out in April by the International Cable Protection Committee implementing one of the recommendations that gives statistics on the downtime associated with particular oceans for connectivity. These statistics had never been available before. In fact, people in London from at least one particular government were vehement in saying there's no way the industry would ever agree to cooperate to do this because these are competitive companies, and how would they be able to trust each other to give these kind of statistics out? Well, they've done it, and the ICP has actually said that they'll probably be able to provide information for all of the oceans, you know, within roughly a year's time frame. Now, what this does is dramatic for the financial services sector, to give one example, because they're being asked by the Basel Accords to increasingly integrate operational risk as a fundamental component in determining how, you know, the rates loans are given and such like that. So this actually affects a slight amount how central banks would determine what rates, you know, certain lenders would get, capital and stuff. So these are very important things, and also by measuring things, you'll be able to improve them, and we'll be able to make, again, things more stable. The third example I'd like to give is work that we did with that began with a China-U.S. bilateral on fighting spam to build trust. And here we have 46 best practices that experts, even as recently as yesterday, at the FICI private meetings we had, were saying there's the best list of best practices out there for fighting spam and botnets. We've now gone to outreach, and we had events here in India, bringing together the top spam fighting experts here with those from elsewhere around the world. And we are planning on moving on to talk to other countries after this. Recently, India had actually been identified as the largest contributor to spam internationally earlier this year, and the United States is also up there in the top few. So having these countries work together is very important to compare notes when you consider about 90% of all email, is spam, and it's the vehicle for a lot of malicious code. This is something that we can't ignore. So here's very practical examples of how we're making contributions, and there's many other areas. But all of the recommendations that you'll see in these reports articulated very tightly. There's a methodology that we use where we say, here's what the problem is, here's what needs to be done, here's alternatives, like don't do anything and what the consequences would be, what the next steps are for implementation, and what the measures of success are. So we really know when we nailed it. And it's your ideas and careful rigor in these discussions that help us do that effectively. This is the template you're going to see when you go to the breakthrough groups that help you think through this process. So the idea is that we try to get these filled out and such. And let me say one other thing. We have 20 interactive sessions this week. We had 4 yesterday, actually, at some meetings that were a continuation of some India-U.S. bilateral work we did. But some of them are, I say they're interactive, some of them are interest seminars. Because of the progress that was made, there's a feeling by the groups that we need to give a readout for some of these things. So you'll see the topics for which there's readouts. And the rest of all these topics are also covered in interactive breakthrough groups, and some other topics that are not mentioned here. That's the same for those. So today there's 2 sessions. Immediately following, in just in a few moments, I'll conclude my remarks. We're going to have lunch out here on the lawn. So you just walk out here and make a left, and there'll be lunch there. And then we have 2 slots this afternoon. They're each 90 minutes each, and they're separated by a break. And then we come back tomorrow morning. There's an optional discussion at 8 o'clock. There'll be an open discussion about how the breakthrough groups went. And then there'll be a formal plenary up here, and then there'll be 2 more sessions in the morning, then we'll do the rest of our plenary program after that. After we conclude this summit, we have some immediate things that will be coming out, including a report on this summit and including some outreach from the Priority International Communications report that I showed you, and also some other reports that will be coming out based on some final work that's being done here. We also have a special keynote address by Michael Chertoff, former U.S. Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. So please come back for dinner for that special evening tonight. So again, underscoring the fact that this is about you being part of the solution. All these things we talked about are because of you and people like you, if you're just getting involved for the first time, contributing with your ideas and making this what it is. So thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you over the next 2 days. Thank you. Thanks.